Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and today we are going to have a very special episode as our director, Guntram Wolff, is finishing his third and final mandate at the helm of our think tank on the 30th of June 2022. This is a good moment to look back at the past decade of economic policy in Europe and the contribution Bruegel gave to try improving it. Hi Guntram, and welcome to The Sound of Economics, exceptionally as a guest.
Hi Giuseppe.
Guntram, you arrived at Bruegel in 2011. When you started, you found a think tank which was trying to analyze and make policy proposals in the very middle of the storm, as we say. We were just a few years from the big 2007 financial crisis, and we were in the middle of the so-called Euro crisis, if we can say so retrospectively. We want to try to look back, starting from when you arrived. How were things back then, and which were the main topics that you personally were involved in, and also how did you see Bruegel acting as a think tank trying to make sense of what was going on in this period?
Well, Giuseppe, so when I joined in 2011, I joined straight from DG ECFIN at the European Commission, and I had been really sort of in the middle of the discussions on Eurozone imbalances, on the Greek bailout, and on many sort of Eurozone crisis-related issues. And it was really for a reason that I came to Bruegel, because I really thought it was doing tremendously important work, doing very clear analysis and also describing policy options that are critical. And, I remember really 2011 and 12 being dominated by the discussion on, how do we break this link between banks and sovereigns, which was an important driver of the Eurozone crisis. So we had all these financial difficulties in the periphery. The banking system was fragile in the periphery of the Eurozone, or in the countries in the south, in particular of the Eurozone. And the ECB was very exposed to risk in banks. And, the fragility in the banking system was spilling over to fragility to the sovereigns. And in turn, this fragility in the sovereigns were spilling over back to the fragility in the banks. So, we had these papers together with Nicolas Véron, André Sapir, and Jean Pisani-Ferry. We had a paper quite early on really arguing for what became to be known a banking union. So with a basic idea to cut this vicious circle between banks and sovereigns. And, this was a very, very big, important debate. And we presented it also afterwards in Cyprus with Jean to the informal ECOFIN, to the EU finance ministers, and, had a very, very vivid debate. So this was, I think, one sort of key starting point. At the same time, it was clear that this is not just financial and sovereign issues. There are also important divergences in price competitiveness, in current account imbalances. A lot of adjustment, real economic adjustment was was happening also in the financial assistance programs that were given to Greece, Portugal, and Ireland. So these were really big and very difficult adjustment processes with lots of unemployment. And then, of course, a lot of political, I would say almost hate coming up between countries, between nations, but also directed at individuals, that including the former German finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble, who was very much critiqued, of course, in the south of Europe. And so this was politically, but also really analytically, economically, a very, very exciting time for, I would say, any policy analyst. And here at Bruegel, we really had a couple of really great minds, and we were working so closely together. I became the deputy director to Jean Pisani-Ferry. André Sapir was really important in that period. Also, of course, Nicolas Véron. So we were a group of 4 or 5 people, and were really discussing and writing books. Let me perhaps mention 2 more books very quickly. I mean, one book was on the EU IMF financial assistance programs. We were among the first really evaluating these programs and providing first insights on what went wrong and what was done correctly. And, these programs were the biggest financial assistance programs in the history of international financial institutions. So this was one important book, and I think the other one was actually, and that was a very fun exercise, was a real simulation game where we brought together players from key countries and simulated what would end the Eurozone crisis. And in this simulation that I think took place in 2012 or late 11, I don't quite remember, we basically came very quickly to the result that the one thing that would end this whole sort of very fragile situation would be a commitment by the European Central Bank to act as a lender of last resort. And then comes 2012, and Mario Draghi gives his famous speech in London announcing that within his mandate, the ECB would do whatever it takes, and spreads were closing, and the situation calmed down. And so we in our simulation game, we had been right on spot. We had really sort of anticipated what Mario Draghi would say later on. And so I guess then comes 2013, that the Greek debt restructuring, of course, was important. And we had strong and heated debates on the debt restructuring and whether it's useful and how quickly it should be done, how early it should be done. So I would say that's perhaps the first 2.5, 3 years, 2011 to 13, which I think were really dominated by these issues on the Eurozone. And I would say Bruegel scholars were in all the major debates really involved, advising ministers, advising the ECOFIN, advising parliamentarians, talking to the European Commission. So it was really a very exciting period, I have to say.
I can imagine. First of all, I want to mention to our listeners that we are going to link in the show notes some of the references that you have been making for all the documents that are available. We are going to put a reading list so that we have some short anthology of those very important moments that you are recalling. Just one follow-up question, perhaps, on what you just said about this period before moving on with our time machine and going fast forward into the next years. You mentioned that this was really a moment where there was a certain emotion around economic issues, which was dripping down to even the technical debates about sovereign debts or banks and so on, started to be really something that was not only relegated to very technical circles, but started to be somehow of interest for the wider public, became a little bit mainstream. I should say, Bruegel played a big role in advising ECOFIN, advising ministers, advising policymakers, but also played quite a big role, I think, in this phase to start bringing the analysis to the wider public. And you have been quite on the forefront of that transformation of Bruegel, right?
I would say Bruegel played an extremely important role in that period for 3 reasons. I mean, the first is, I think, really, we were one of the very few platforms where there wasn't just one national interest, but really a truly European view on things. So we were not a French institute just talking from Paris, or a German institute just talking from German city, or a Greek institute just talking from Athens. We were really a Europe, and we are still a European platform, and our scholars come from all these different countries, and we're really debating on the basis of facts and evidence among ourselves. And so I think this was really important. And that's why also our voice was heard, because people could see that, there was a genuine attempt here to address the issue and look at the issue from a truly European perspective, so from the perspective of a European citizen. And so I think this is really one important element, especially at a moment when a German minister was going to Greece. I mean, there were threats to his life and vice versa. People in German streets were just talking about the lazy Greeks and all of that. The emotions were strong. So I think this was really important. Now, the second, as you say, of course, we are technical people. I mean, we are PhD economists, most of us, and sort of like to talk in data and facts and equations. But we, of course, play a role in reaching out to the wider audiences. And, when we look back at sort of press statistics, we actually didn't have that many press mentionings in that period, and it only gradually increased over the years. And I always said, look, I mean, an important part of our role is really also to become a voice, that a pan-European voice, a real European voice that is being listened to also in the national capitals. And so also with you, Giuseppe, I think over the years, a very strong media strategy. And, I can now proudly say that, in 2011, our yearly press mentions were around 2,000 or 3,000. Now in the first 5 months of this year, we had 25,000 mentions. So more than a tenfold increase in our press statistics. And I think that's really important because we need European debates on these issues as we grow closer together.
Indeed. But let's move forward in our time traveling. And in 2013, you become the director of Bruegel. And somehow we are still in a situation very much dominated by those topics that you just mentioned, linked to the Eurozone, to the future of the Eurozone. Is one member of the Eurozone going to leave or not? There was a lot of questions around that. But it was also the starting point of a new phase. How did you live these first years as director on the policy front?
On the policy front, I think Eurozone issues clearly did not disappear. I mean, there was still very much the debate on the fiscal adjustments and how quickly they should be done. Some people talked of excessive austerity, and others were saying, well, not enough is done. And so I think we played an important role also in that debate, pointing out that excessively fast fiscal adjustment is counterproductive and not only leads to higher unemployment, but also does create, I would say, it's actually counterproductive in the sense that the GDP collapse may be so large that to GDP ratios are not decreasing, but rather increasing as a result of excessive austerity. So this was an important debate. And it really was important for many citizens. And I think one topic we highlighted early on was also youth unemployment and the fact that a lot of young people in the south of Europe were losing hopes for their future. And, we had a sort of lost generation. And I think it was important to point that out. And then I think increasingly more geopolitical topics became relevant. And
so all of a sudden we had the migration crisis in 2015. You were just trying to finalize your analysis about the Greek referendum, and another major shock arrives and somehow shaking Europe, saying Europe is not an island, and those debates within the capitals have to take into consideration the wider geopolitical frame, right?
Yeah, so there was the so-called migration crisis, which, if we think back, was essentially the war in Syria, where, by the way, also Vladimir Putin of Russia played a huge role. And, many Syrians, often quite well educated, really were just trying to escape the horror of the bombing and the horror of the war in Syria. And, were fleeing to Europe. And this was, I guess, a strong moment when the German Chancellor Angela Merkel was sort of welcoming the Syrian refugees. And, that led to a lot of internal conflict within Germany. But I think it was also really used and abused in the British debate, which sort of suggested that by staying in the EU, millions of refugees would land in the UK. And so then we had this very unfortunate Brexit campaign that was really a distorting campaign in the UK. We had a few summits where European leaders were also somewhat half convinced and not really trying to keep the UK. And, then we had this referendum result. And I remember waking up the morning, seeing the referendum result and thinking, oh, this is big and this is going to keep me busy. And it kept us busy.
And it kept you busy for long. That's also the thing. It's like that Brexit was a very lengthy affair, if we can say so.
Yeah, I mean, so Brexit was a very lengthy affair. I think it consumed way too much political capital. I mean, it was important, of course, but political capital that it consumed and the time and the commentary that over the years was used. I mean, there was a point where British papers only talked about Brexit, about nothing else. European papers started to move on after a year. But in the UK, I think a lot of time was lost. But also in Europe, a lot of energy was just lost on something that fundamentally doesn't make a lot of sense. And so I guess what our role was there is, I think very early on, we were, I think, quite courageous and sort of sitting together. And I remember this very much. I brought together a group of 5 colleagues from different countries, from France, from Germany, even from the UK and from Belgium. And we were really literally over the summer of 2016, right after the referendum, we were sort of having our calls and basically discussing what could be a solution. And our paper was controversial, but I think it did push the debate, the Continental Partnership. It did push the debate, and I think it hardened the European stance on the UK. And our paper in the end was very much rejected. But I would say we are still in a state where this question of what is the relationship between the EU and its neighboring countries remains more or less unresolved. I mean, we don't have a particularly good relation with the UK, but we also do have problems with Switzerland, actually, which is one of the oldest democracies in the world. We have problems with Turkey. We are now looking at Ukraine. And of course, at Ukraine, we have now the idea to get the Ukraine as a full member. But I would say a lot of work still needs to be done on sort of neighborhood and the relations between a core EU or Eurozone and the wider Europe. And so in that sense, I think our paper was an important paper at that moment.
So you would judge the Continental Partnership proposal, just for resuming to our listeners, because not everyone might have read it, and of course we are going to make a link in the notes. Would you judge that proposal that was born out of Brexit as something that could still, of course, with some adjustments and contextualization, still a working basis for further reflection on the role of Europe with its neighborhood?
I think what the paper was, it was, of course, meant to provoke the debate. It was a courageous paper. I think in hindsight, I would say perhaps a naive paper. Clearly, we're assuming a better political relation between the EU and the UK than became a reality in the years after the referendum. And so in that sense, I would not have republished that paper 1 or 2 years later. But I think the paper contains elements of variable geometry that are now again discussed. I mean, now Enrico Letta and the French government are exactly talking about a wider political community, which is essentially the idea to have a heads of state meeting, European Council meeting, which includes non-EU members, so including President Zelensky. But of course, then if you think logically, it would also include the UK Prime Minister. So I think the sort of the broader point that on the European continent, we need a platform to talk beyond the EU with each other. I think that point certainly still stands.
Indeed. Going back to our time machine, those years, Brexit, as you said, it was consuming a lot of our energies, but it was 2016, it's also, again, the continuation of this new era, I would say, or like the beginning of this new era where political issues have been more and more driving the economic agenda. Alongside Brexit, we had also the election of Donald Trump and, let's say, a completely reconfiguration of the relations at the global level on one hand. On the other hand, we've been having the Paris agreements and, as a tale of Obama's years on the other side. And more issues related to climate and the climate emergency to be in. Bruegel has been navigating these two issues and somehow transforming a bit some of the issues which were a bit more sectorial or again, more technical, became more horizontal in the work that we've been doing here.
Yeah, look, I think Trump and Brexit was a rise of populism, which, to be honest, I was sort of feeling at the beginning of the year and had a bet actually with a colleague that both Brexit and Trump would happen, and both happened, and I wasn't particularly happy that they happened, but I did win my bet. And so this was a watershed moment, and I think in particular the election of President Trump was a huge shock and was a moment where I think European policymakers started to realize that the project of the European Union cannot just be an economic project. It had to be a project which thinks about the geopolitical role of the European Union and thinks about what would Europe do if on the security side it cannot rely on the US anymore. And a lot of the debate then really was about more security issues, but European Union, I mean, in its DNA doesn't really have a security branch. And so we focused in our work very much then on what I would call geoeconomics. So thinking about what economic measures that need to be taken to increase the geopolitical resilience of the European Union. And that includes things such as an investment screening mechanism or reducing excessive dependencies on individual suppliers, and so on and so forth. And so this, I would say, I would call that the starting point of the really big geoeconomic debate. And we had an important paper on European economic sovereignty. That's the buzzword that was used. And as you say, then importantly, climate considerations became increasingly important. So the global public good climate was important, and people realized, well, the Europeans need to be at the forefront of climate action, and that actually, again, has geopolitical implications. And so we had a lot of, I would say, exciting projects and papers in which we discuss about the geopolitical implications of the European Green Deal, where we pushed also the European Commission in our memos to the Commission to have a strong strategy on not only decarbonizing Europe's economy, but really also thinking about how to deal with the international fallout from a European decarbonization strategy. And so I would say this was a much more geopolitical period. So in a sense, if you look back, we first had a very Eurozone-centric debate. Then we had a sort of more increasingly political debate, also mostly European debate. And then we start having really a big geopolitical debate about what is Europe's role in the world.
And then COVID arrived. All of a sudden, some of the things that were being done had to pause, as we all paused at some point, but also created a new set of challenges for the economies, for the citizens, for the health and safety of everyone. Bruegel, and particularly you, Guntram, you've been quite at the forefront of advocating since the beginning of the pandemic for clear response and clear preparedness to get prepared for the next crisis. So I think this was also another watershed moment for your tenure here.
Yeah, thank you. That's very kind of you. I think really COVID was important for a variety of reasons. I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, the huge change in all of our own personal life, but also as an institution. It was a huge change because we all worked from home, which everybody did. But I mean, we managed it also, and we managed it very quickly and quickly moved digitally and became really also in that episode for our analysis of the implications of COVID on the economy. And I think we were telling also finance ministers at the time very early on that this is huge and that we need a major program of support for our economies to basically cope with the fallout from the lockdown measures on our economy. And so this was, I think, a quite important and quickly, I think people and we realized and also argued then that given that different countries of the EU would be able to support their economies to different degrees, there was a really big risk that the European single market would fragment. And we saw some direct fragmentation that countries didn't want to deliver masks to neighboring countries. But we also really saw the risk of fragmentation that in some countries, companies would just be propped up with taxpayers' money and in others not. And so very early on, we argued for a joint European fiscal response. And I think I got really encouraged by the fact that the European Union really managed COVID very well by having two major policy innovations. The one was the Recovery Fund, which was a Franco-German project initially the other big European innovation was to decide at the height of a health crisis to procure vaccines jointly and ask the Commission to do this. I mean, this was a huge step in terms of trust in the European Union, trust in the European institutions. And while I was initially really worried, and the European Commission did have some delays in the delivery of vaccines, I mean, then very quickly this was addressed. And in the end, I think it was really a job well done. And I think the European Union really gained a lot of trust because of its management of the COVID pandemic. And I think we made the right points. Perhaps the last point on COVID, this became quickly also, of course, a major question of global policy coordination. How do we make sure that everybody is safe? Because unless everybody's safe, nobody is safe. That's very clear because the virus can mutate. And as long as it's everywhere circulating, it will mutate. So how can we support poorer countries in the world? And I think there is, again, a more depressing note. It was clear that financing for pandemic preparedness should be top of the agenda and that not a lot of money is needed. We were talking of 2-digit billion US dollars per year. We calculated those numbers. And I think the West, the G7, also the European Union, in the end did not put up enough money for that. And so I think it was, in a sense, a disappointment. The global leadership aspirations that the West, the European Union has, couldn't materialize because nobody was ready to put up the 2-digit numbers. And so our call, for example, with a group of international finance experts at the G20 meeting in Venice to actually come up with more significant monies was only half-heartedly taken on board.
Indeed, and this is still an ongoing issue because the pandemic is still with us, and there is still, I would say, time for keeping this reflection alive. So this is still work in progress to a certain extent, we hope. Or do you think this is a done,
No, I mean, I think... Look, I think the one question that it raises is that given how difficult it is to agree globally on a 2-digit number for COVID, how much more difficult is it going to be to address global challenge climate change, where, of course, the more advanced economies will have to not just use the stick, but also the carrot to ensure that decarbonization efforts accelerate, not just in Europe, but elsewhere. And so I think this is a little bit of a
kind of a lesson learned, but also a little bit leaves us with some sort of bitterness in what has been going on.
Yeah, I mean, bitterness, I'm not sure I want to use that word, but to me on the climate front, I mean, I put my hope increasingly in technology and less in politics. I think it's going to be climate change and emissions are going to go down as, green technology becomes cheaper and fossil fuel becomes more expensive. And in that sense, so the coordination mechanism, in a sense, is going to be the market. And in that sense, the energy crisis and the attack of Russia on energy security globally, I think, is going to drive investments into renewables. Short term, we also invest in fossil fuel infrastructure, of course, because we have to sort of finally diversify out of Russia. But the incentives are there to put solar panels on your roof because you're going to save a lot on your energy bill.
On this note, we get towards the end of our conversation because you started to mention a little bit your hopes for the future and your future role is the director of the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. So you're going to keep being in a very interesting observatory of what's going to happen in the next few years. And if I may now ask you a question, not as outgoing director of Bruegel, but more like as a future director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, what is your short-term to medium-term forecast, given the complex situation that we've been highlighting and these past 10 years that you've been observing from Brussels? What shall we expect? I wouldn't expect you to have a crystal ball and tell us exactly what is going to happen, but what kind of trends and topics we should be alert analyze and to eventually provide policy responses for?
Well, I mean, so this can go in many different directions, of course. I think Bruegel really is extremely well positioned to deal with all the big policy issues rising on the economic front. And I think one strength here is really the very high analytical capacity of the team, but paired with a willingness to debate and, to also have a diversity of views and to accept facts and arguments over particular interests, be that national interests or business-driven interests or anything else. I mean, so this, I think this is really the key recipe. I mean, independence, rigor, trust in good arguments and good data, and of course, debate and peer review in the team. And so I think this is where I would put my hope in the future. And, I think Bruegel will do well. And in my new role, I want to take sort of some of these good elements with me, and of course also work with my future team, with my future colleagues in advancing the debate. And I think the debate, of course, is there going to be more focused on foreign affairs and geopolitical issues, global climate implications, geoeconomic questions. So there's a lot of overlap, but of course there's also, and the European integration questions, which of course are extremely important also for German foreign policy think tanks. So a lot of the topics continue, but of course there will be a shift in emphasis. So I'm quite looking forward also to working with new colleagues and discussing even broader topics.
And we are going to be happy to invite you at the Sound of Economics, hopefully as guest in your new role, because as you say, there is going to be a lot of overlaps in the topics that we are going to keep working on both sides. So this is not definitely a farewell for you at the Sound of Economics.
No, I don't want it to be a farewell, and I think it's more continuing to work together, and I really think I want to thank you, Giuseppe. I want to thank every person that worked with Bruegel and over the last years, and also all the friends and the broader circle that supported us over these years. I think this is really the work of a wonderful group of people, and so I think this is the key for a successful institute.
Thank you, and we are going towards the end of this episode. I just would like to remind everyone that you can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website, www.bruegel.org, and that many of the works that were mentioned in this special episode are referenced in the show notes. Thanks, Guntram. Thanks to our listener for following us, and until next time, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.